I want to thank you for your attendance in this specialized topic, which doesn't attract the masses but attracts the elites. I want to thank, first of all, Professor Jonathan Aronson for his kindness and willingness to present some of his ideas in this forum. You came here to listen to him, so simply let me give you some highlights about his trajectory. Professor Aronson is a professor of communication at the Annenberg School of Communication, University of Southern California, Los Angeles, probably the leading communication school in the United States. He is a professor also of international relations at the University of Southern California. And he has been working for a long, long time on issues of international trade in telecommunications, issues of regulation of communication and telecommunications, and issues of the political economy of communication and telecommunication, besides other more general topics related to international trade and particularly trade in services. He often defines himself as a political economist, and what I think is interesting, he considers political economy to be the field in which you analyze the connection between power and money, which therefore places his work in a very central condition of understanding our world. If in addition you add power, money, communication, and telecommunications, practically all the rest is marginal.
Sex.
Now, he has recently published with his colleague and co-author and for a long time, Peter Cowie, this book, Transforming Global Information and Communication Markets, The Political Economy of Innovation, published by MIT Press a few months ago. This is a book that is available online for free, and MIT Press now is doing this with a number of books, and it's actually working well, increases the sales of hard copies. And one of the questions surrounding tonight's topic, the Obama administration's communication policy, is because by all kinds of accounts, this book has been quite influential in the ideas of the Obama administration about communication policy. And a number of people, experts who have been working in this field closely or with or around Jonathan Aronson had been appointed to the administration, including Peter Cowie as one of the key persons in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, therefore in charge of discussing the connection between the U.S. economy and the global economy in a number of issues, including telecommunication markets. Therefore, Jonathan has this privileged position of being inside and outside at the same time of the Obama administration, so he knows as much as many other people, but he can say a number of things. Not everything, but he can say more than what the people who are in the administration could do at this point. And this is a very interesting and privileged position, particularly for us. And since we are in a family circle, I think you can share more of your knowledge. We don't need any privileged information, but we need your insight about what's going on in an administration that for many people in the world, for much of the planet, is a symbol of hope, which is rare in the political realm. So without further introduction, that was mainly to allow our colleagues to come in late in the room. I simply, particularly Juliet, that's for you not to be noticed, you know. So please, Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. It's really been a great pleasure to visit UOC and Manuel and Barcelona and to meet some new friends, because I hope to come back often in this. And I want to thank everybody for their kindness in doing that, in welcoming me. Before I begin talking about the Obama administration, I'd like to make a couple of points. One, those of you who heard it's free can look it up and download it, either chapter by chapter or the whole book at
or even one sentence.
I don't think you can do that. I think you have to do a whole chapter at globalinfoandtelecom.org. So that is where you get it. In terms of the influence, that is always a very difficult thing to say. I do not speak for the administration, but I am very proud that the only complaint I have so far had about the book came from the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, whose complaint was he couldn't download it onto his Kindle because he liked carrying it around. So that was a high piece of praise. I should finally say that what I have said here with my collaborator is not U.S. policy. It was written in its entirety before Obama was elected to be president. We, of course, try and persuade people that there are some ideas that might be worth looking at, but as is inevitable in these sorts of things, the administration has lots and lots of people who are making suggestions as to what they ought to do. And this is just one small voice. We hope over time it will cause discussion. Now, question number one is, why should we care? Manuel has said that this is a fairly specialized and esoteric topic. I would actually argue it's a fairly central topic, because the global ICT market, which is to say information, communications, and telecommunications, made up of the computer, hardware, software, and services, plus communication, all of which is coming together, is on the order of just under 3 trillion euros a year worldwide. That's a huge number, and it's growing. That further, along with healthcare, in all industrial economies, communications has been one of the fastest growing sectors, becoming a larger and larger percentage of every country's economy, and it is the piece that binds together global communities and economies, so that it is the binding force among countries and is absolutely international. Now, I am not. I don't do very well on television sometimes because I don't believe in black and white. I don't think anything is perfect. I am not a believer that government should run everything, but neither am I a believer that government is irrelevant and we should leave it to quote some of the economists, the magic of the market. I think that there is a role for proactive regulation, but that it should be done with great smartness and great care. What we need today is a vision of the next policy, and ultimately that's going to have to be an international and global picture because of the nature of the beast. You no longer can have national policy, even the United States national policy, dictating. Now, one final thing that I have been tutored by Professor Castells in is, here we are in Barcelona talking about U.S. policy. I want to make very clear that I don't think that U.S. is going to push, pull, or force Spain or Europe to do anything. But I think that the same major factors that are pushing the United States to move and reconsider certain issues are also present elsewhere. So that while no country is going to exactly do whatever it is the United States finally chooses to do, what you're going to see are the same kinds of issues are going to need to be confronted in a lot of places. Now, I've divided what I'm going to say tonight into three major sections. Now, first, it should be said, communications in terms of the pecking order is not at the top. It's not in the top 10 issues that Obama is looking at. It's probably not in the top 20 issues that's on his table. A president can do usually 2 and certainly not more than 3 major things at a time. And right now, Obama is stuck with 3 huge issues that are occupying most of the administration's time. The first is economic stimulus, growth, jobs, recovery, as everybody in the world is concerned with. The second is health care, which is the bill that is in front of the U.S. Congress, which is highly contentious. It is such a contentious issue in the United States that the last 7 U.S. presidents have failed to get any kind of a health care bill through. So whatever comes out, if he gets a bill, it won't be perfect. Everybody on every side will attack it, but it will probably go a fair distance at reducing the 46 million Americans who have no health care. So if it reduces from 46 to 20 million the number of uninsured in the United States, it is a major success, even at the same time that it is still a problem because so many people will be unemployed. Given that, the first issue that the administration has turned to is investment in innovation, and particularly in the short term in economic stimulus and growth. The second I will discuss today are issues of what is called preserving the open internet. It is often tagged under the slogan of network neutrality, but they're trying to get away from that term because it's politically charged and say, we want an open internet that benefits everyone. It sounds much better. And within that, I'll talk briefly about the recent ICANN agreement. Third, I'll talk a little bit about the FCC's National Broadband Plan, and then I'll mention a few other things that are being dealt with but have not really been formulated in a way that they can make a whole lot of sense. I should say about the National Broadband Plan is that part of what has prompted it is the United States usually ranks in OECD listings about 15th in the world in broadband penetration. And this has caused tremendous political embarrassment within the United States because America likes to always be number 1, 2, or 3 in everything, so that this has created the political alliance necessary to actually start doing something on that. So going to the first one, stimulus. In the short term, and I should probably note, I normally do not use PowerPoints. But since not all of you speak English as a first language, I have sacrificed and compromised by doing that. But I hope, but I'm not going to read them by and large, so that they're really there sort of to create an outline and a structure of what I hope to say. Investment in the short term, the economy that Obama inherited was a disaster. The financial crisis was ongoing. The loss of jobs, which has continued but has slowed, was hemorrhaging. Wall Street was on the brink of literal collapse, perhaps spurring an economic meltdown. This caused everybody to focus first on what are we going to do about this? Putting more money in, so the economy in ways that could be spent as quickly as possible was one of them. And one of those issues happened to be telecom. So the Department of Commerce, through something called the National Telecommunications and Information Agency, and oddly, the Department of Agriculture, because they deal with rural communications, was given literally several $billion and said, let's spend it on infrastructure. Do something. You know, where do you need it? Where do we have, in particular, shovel-ready projects that we can build out infrastructure and get people back to work? So that was the first one. It wasn't supposed to be controversial. It, of course, became controversial because the new Democratic leaders were spending money and creating deficits and going back to John Maynard Keynes. How terrible, a European. Over the long term, the investment in infrastructure is part of a larger project that has been focusing on how do you make sure that fundamental research is revitalized in the United States. There is fear that it has slowed, that it is not as dynamic as it has been, and there's a lot of attention of trying to figure out what to do. Part of the problem is education, a big part of the problem. Arguably, America has the largest selection of great universities in the world, from MIT to the University of Southern California, from Stanford to Harvard. It's a pretty good group of schools. Arguably, the United States pre-college educational system is a shambles. There are pockets of excellence, but there are large portions of wasteland, which are underserving students, particularly those who can't afford to buy into a very good education. On the long term, if we don't have an educated workforce, like everybody else, the United States is going to suffer, and that has become a focus of how do you improve it. Again, it's not one of the top three, but education is going to be a big issue in this administration, and particularly the R&D and the K through 12. Part of this leads back to ICT and building a leading infrastructure and developing an advanced information technology ecosystem to foster research, to foster innovation. Innovation, sort of the in word at the moment. It's a little embarrassing that Israel almost has as many startups as the United States and has more than either France or Germany at the moment in any given year. So we're going around and saying, what's going on? How do we continue the great success that we had in Silicon Valley and elsewhere? How do we deal with that? And there's a lot of concern in some top minds. One of the things about this administration that is quite different is the last administration was exceedingly religious. President Bush got his directions from on high. By contrast, President Obama prefers Nobel laureates to advise him on science and these kinds of issues, so that the national academies, his scientific advisors, his energy secretary is a Nobel laureate, and one of the two members of his chief scientific advisory team is also a Nobel laureate. So these are very, very distinguished scientists, and Obama, while not a scientist, takes the science seriously. I'm going to leave the investment and innovation at that and turn to the beginnings of the next issue. But I want to go backwards for a second and note sort of the basics of U.S. policy that have now stretched back and evolved over the last 40 or 50 years. These are not quite the same as those that exist in Europe, so it is important to consider it very carefully. The first that developed probably the earliest was what has come to be known as no harm to the network. AT&T, our monopoly, like many other monopolies around the world, argued for a very long time that the only equipment that could be attached to its network was equipment that it made. And they had these big black rotary phones that they wouldn't sell to you. They would only lease them to you. And they were indestructible. You could throw them against a wall and nothing would happen. And if by some chance you managed to break one, they would send out a technician at no charge, and they would hand you another phone. Over a prolonged period, AT&T was forced to admit that, well, maybe you could attach something to their network that wouldn't break it. And through a long series of legal issues that I'm not going to bore you with, we got to a time where today you can attach, the idea is if it won't break the network, you can put it on. If you have a better kind of phone, if you have a better computer, you can put this in. Now, why did AT&T want to do this? Because it's worth thinking back into the politics of this. AT&T had a major rival, a little company called IBM. Now, IBM, about this time, was getting into this newfangled stuff of computers. And IBM came up with the idea, and so you finally got PCs from IBM and others, which was that you could have some real intelligence in the terminals. AT&T said, but the intelligence needs to be in the network. And IBM said, no, we think smart terminals are a good idea. Now that, of course, was exactly against the interests of the phone company. They wanted to keep all the profitable, powerful pieces to them. They didn't want to be just a dumb pipe. So over time, and it was highly political, IBM won the argument. And attachment was allowed, competition was allowed, so that MCI was able to come in to compete with on long-distance services, and others were allowed to show that they could also provide services or equipment or software to the network. Now, that's the first. The second norm, and here there is a considerable difference from Europe. Americans, socialism to Americans is sort of a really bad thing. Not quite sure why. It went so far that during the World War I, the Massachusetts legislature was about to ban all red flags because they were afraid of the Soviet Union, until the senior people at Harvard reminded them that would also mean banning the Harvard flag. at which point they went on. And this has continued. Americans have favored instead technology neutrality instead of government planning. We do not have, for the most part, national champions. We instead prefer, say, the more the merrier. We can try 3 or 4 or more different standards, and whichever one wins out in the end, that's great. And if more than one survive, that's okay too. So that this has been a long-standing policy preference of the US, unlike Europe and much of Asia, which is tend to have the government designate more. We want you to do this way and you to do this standard. So that's a little bit different. A third norm of US policy is that things are getting more modular. The way I like to describe it is think of Lego blocks. Lego blocks are these sort of toys, many colors and many shapes, which you can put together in any way you want, but the great advantage of these things is they have the same interface, so that any one Lego block can be plugged into another one, and you can build all sorts of things. Americans became intrigued with the idea of modularity, not only in hardware, but also in networks, in software, and belatedly in content as well, saying that the goal should be that if you've got a better idea in any one of those 4 areas, you should be able to take advantage of it. And it shouldn't matter where in the world that better idea comes from. The government ought to promote better ideas and newer ideas, and should try, not always successfully, to keep larger established companies from squashing it. Fourth, the government began to move towards competition. The US loves competition. We ought to have as much competition as possible. It didn't work all the time. It wasn't always done very well. The Federal Communications Commission made their fair share of mistakes. But by and large, there has been a general push to, we'd like to have more than 2 competitors providing services, particularly value-added services, in any market. So that's the basics of the basic norms of US policy. Now, this leads to the Broadband Initiative. And allow me to read a couple of quotes that come in. I think this is actually out of, this is both broadband and open internet. J. Rockefeller of the Rockefeller family, a senator from West Virginia of all places, is the person in the US Senate who is pushing a lot of this. And I'm a little out of order. Actually, let me come back to that. That's really more broadband, and it got out of order. So let's go to open internet. Open internet, often called network neutrality, but open internet sounds better, is something that has just passed in what the US call an NPRM. Now, what that means is a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. So what the government has said is, we're really interested in this, and over the next few months, would you please comment? And they provided a long paper, which is available online, as to what they're thinking about. One thing they are thinking about, and this is from the current chairman, who was a law school buddy of the president's, government should not be in the business of running or regulating the internet. Government should promote competition. It should protect the consumer's right to access lawful content. Note the lawful. applications and services of their choosing, and government must not restrict the free flow of information over the net. You know, that's dogma. Now, of course, everybody who doesn't like what they have proposed is saying, well, actually, this is going to be socialism, and you're going to do exactly the opposite and control the internet. But, you know, this is what the Federal Communications Commission believes that they are going to do. The key piece in the last paragraph of the executive summary, this is actually from the notice. It has long been U.S. policy to promote an internet that is both open and unregulated. Not exactly true, but, you know, it sounds nice. Nothing we have done over the past several years or that we propose today alters that commitment. So that's what they believe, that's what they say they're doing. Even one of the Republicans, the opposition party commissioners, weighed in on the international side. When I think of an open internet in the international context, I think of the importance of the free flow of all types of lawful information over the internet. I believe that these freedoms, that openness, are no less relevant today. And on this, there is no disagreement at this commission. And I make this point lest the rest of the world get the wrong idea. Now, you watch this very carefully. Now, in fact, there is huge difference on what this whole thing is going to mean. They don't agree on where they're going, but we at least have some idea, and then it becomes open to debate over the next 6 months. In 2004, the then chairman of the Bush Federal Communications, Michael Powell, is the son of General Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State at the time and sort of had a higher pay grade, pronounced what he called the 4 net freedoms. That everybody should have freedom of access whatever content they wanted, that everybody should have freedom to use whatever applications they wanted, that everybody had freedom to attach whatever personal devices they wished as long as it did not harm the network. And they had the freedom to obtain service plan information, which is to say you were required to explain to people what they were signing on to, which has always been a problem because the print on some of this is so small that nobody can read it. So these 4 pieces serve the basis and are translated into this new document. The new document also adds 2 additional freedoms. The most controversial of this is non-discrimination, that you must treat lawful content, applications, and services in a non-discriminatory manner. And the final one is transparency. Well, transparency is simply you should tell people what they're getting. And that's okay, we can deal with that. But the non-discrimination, I suspect, is where the biggest of the political fight is going to come. First, AT&T and Verizon think that this is an absolutely terrible idea. And they are doing everything in their power to influence the White House, to influence the Federal Communication and the Republican commissioners, to prove to them that this is a terrible idea on a number of levels. The fight that went on, I am told, and this is good inside information, of the AT&T talking to senior White House people way above the Federal Communications Commission trying to block this was considerable. And the trick to remember, the politics to remember here is that traditionally AT&T has had a very large number of their leaders come from Illinois Bell. That's still true. And guess where Barack Obama and so many of his senior people just happened to come from? and just happened to get lots of contributions from while they have been running. So the lines, I am told, were buzzing in terms of some of this. But the result was nonetheless, and importantly, Julius Janikowski managed in ways that I do not know exactly, this is way beyond what I know, but he managed to get all 5 of the commissioners, you have 9, we have 5, to vote in favor of the proposed rulemaking, to let this go forward on a unanimous basis. Now, the 2 Republicans, which is to say those from the out-of-power commissioners, and we always have whoever's president gets 3, and whoever's not, the party that's not president gets 2. So it's always a divided commission. And in fact, if you put 3 commissioners together in a room without proper supervision, it is illegal, because they could vote to change the policy in secret. I guess it would be 5 here. So that non-discrimination, what does that mean? Well, what the government is afraid of is that the operator will slow down certain kinds of traffic from companies that they don't like as much, and perhaps let similar traffic from companies that they have agreements with go through somewhat faster, making it much more desirable for those companies for customers to go to those companies because they don't get the delays. They also agree, and in the language of the NPRM, what it says is you can manage, for security reasons, you can manage the network flow. You have to allow network management so it doesn't get engulfed. But what does that mean is not well defined yet. I suspect we will get more. But it also means, and what's come out in the last day or two, is those who would like to provide peer-to-peer priority services are now saying, what if we want to provide something faster than the norm to those who pay for it? Does this mean we can't do this? So I don't know how this is going to come out. I can predict that one thing with great certainty, that a great number of Washington lawyers are going to make a great amount of money in the next 6 months, writing prospectuses for this. This I can absolutely guarantee you, that the lawyers will get rich. But you're also going to see a lot of non-governmental organizations, you're going to see a lot of people who are organized, who have used the net, make arguments that are quite different. And at some point in the middle of next year, you're going to have to worry about what the internet is. Now, this is an aside. This has happened literally a couple weeks ago. One of the pieces that have gone along with this is there is a group called ICANN, and I always forget what exactly ICANN stands for. But what it does is this is the group that controls the domain names. Now, I'm happy to remind people that originally domain names were controlled entirely by a colleague of mine named Jonathan Pastel, who looked a lot like Karl Marx and who was completely trusted by everybody. He didn't have a political bone in his body, but he was perceived by people from all over the world to be fair. And he made all the initial decisions on that. He sadly died early. A good story worth telling is at one point, the backbone of the internet is controlled by then 13, now 14 major computers. 2 of which are run by the US government and others are run by a bunch of other people. One of which is run in one of our buildings. And he got upset with the US government at one point during the Clinton administration. And he sent out a message to the people who controlled all the other main computers and said, at such and such a time, will you please turn over control of your computer to me, to my computer? And except for the 2 US government computer, everybody did. So he was running the internet all by himself in a very fundamental way. Now, the White House figured this out fairly quickly, and the president or the general counsel, I'm not sure which of my university, got a phone call saying, "What on earth are you doing?" Actually, the language was a good deal more livid. And Pastel got a phone call then and saying, "What on earth are you doing?" I said, "It's just an experiment. I'll give it back." This really happened. It's in the story of it in brief is in the Tim Wu, Jack Goldsmith book on controlling the internet. So I could be making this up, but in fact, I'm not in terms of this. So a lot of people said, you know, and internationally, we're sort of tired of the US Department of Commerce running the internet. We'd sort of like to internationalize it. So ICANN has done that. And over time, it has become more international. And the agreement signed 12 days ago, the US acknowledged that more power had to go to the world, that the internet was, and these are words from the agreement, should be coordinated with but not controlled by the US, but that the US will remain active, and that ICANN will be accountable not to the US but to the whole entire internet community. ICANN is a private organization with public ties. That it will be a multi-stakeholder, private sector, bottom-up decision process. And that we've already seen in those 10 days that ICANN has announced that they are going to very soon begin offering domain names in languages other than English. So if you want a domain name in Korean or Chinese or something else, a Russian, you can now have one, so that everybody doesn't have to go through .com or .edu, which may or may not mean anything. Now, as we were talking at lunch, what this really means remains to be seen. Most people would be, at one point a few years ago, the Chinese made a run at trying to control ICANN. And, you know, if you have a choice, do you want the Chinese government or the US government to be the dominant control? Most people in the West, except the billion and a half Chinese, I suppose, and maybe even they, would prefer the US to be the arbitrator. But it's moving in the right direction. Okay, let me go back then to the third issue. And I have to go back to my out of order slide. The third issue becomes broadband, which is, as I mentioned at the beginning, highly political because the US, on many measures, trails many other countries on broadband implementation. Rockefeller, who's the key guy in the key Senate committee that handles this, chastised the chairman a couple of days ago and said, you know, don't stretch this out too long. I want to see concrete results that are actionable And I want to see them in the report. Don't give me, well, we're going to have to study this some more. I need action because this is political. I want to see concrete action to extend broadband service to underserved and unserved areas, those where people, there's only one provider or they can't get any providers of broadband. Boost adoption among the 33% of U.S. citizens who choose not to describe and direct, or who don't have an option of prescribing, and dramatically increase the speed and capacity of broadband networks. The operators say that what they can do, the average speed is a good deal higher than it actually is. So that what we are creating, and again we substitute something, is a knowledge-based infrastructure that supports applications that facilitate exchange of information in commercial and civic and personal spheres. Basically, what the U.S. says, we want something fast and ubiquitous and affordable. And we'd like to have competition, if we could, among it. That means the ingredients of that: physical communication, networks, end-user devices, software apps, human capital, legal framework. Let's go for it. Let's get this stuff going. Now, the current situation. Where are we right now? The U.S. home broadband adoption rate is, depending on how you measure it and depending on what you call broadband, 63 to 67%. The median advertised speeds is 10 to 25 megabits per second, and that's not true. Probably closer to 7 on the optimal. Competition issue: 50 to 80% of homes with broadband get the desired speed, the fast access, from only one provider, so there isn't. So they're trying, that's what they're trying to address. And we're 15th, 16th, or 17th, depending on how you count, in broadband penetration. Some other options that are happening around the world. Australia this spring announced that they were going to put $30 billion of investment in building a national broadband network that is going to be public. The local telephone incumbent, Telestra, is berserk. They're very unhappy. It would be as if those in Spain said, we're going to put in $30–40 billion and we're going to build our own broadband network to cover every Spaniard, and oh, by the way, we're going to do it in competition with Telefonica. You can imagine the reaction, both joyous and not. Brazil is on the verge, the bill is drafted, of doing something similar. I'm going to have a good deal more information on it in a couple of days, because I'm actually going from here to Brazil to discuss this with them. But they're planning something that, as far as I can make out, is similar to the Australian plan. Again, largely public, because they don't think that the incumbents can manage to do it or are willing to do it. So the state is going to go in it. And I'm sort of the sacrificial American who they think is going to say, oh, you shouldn't, you have to have competition, you can't do that. Well, the truth is they're going to do whatever they want to do. And I've been around long enough, I'm not going to tell them what to do. But I hope to ask some questions of them to see, to provoke their thinking. Some of you may have noticed that Finland, in the last couple of weeks, made history when it declared it a legal right to at least, that every citizen in Finland has a legal right to at least 1 megabyte per second of broadband connection now, and 100 by 2015. How they're going to do that? Well, we'll see. But it is they're putting a challenge out. How it's going to happen is not quite clear, but it is a clear extension of the old idea of universal service That it used to be that you provided a right, and the phone company had to provide a phone everywhere to anybody at an affordable price, and we're now getting that push to broadband. Koreans and Japanese citizens already enjoy 100 megabits per second in many cases. That's really fast. Nobody's quite sure what to do with 100 megabits per second, I should note, beyond downloading a lot of movies. But, it's really, it's sort of a field of dreams. If they send that much bits through, they hope that they will come. What's the FCC doing? The former chief of staff to Reed Hunt, who was chairman under Clinton, a fellow named Blair Levin, has been tasked by Congress, Mr. Rockefeller and others, to produce a U.S. broadband plan by February of 2010. Because of the FCC is an independent agency, but it reports through Congress, not through the president. So it has to, like some other agencies, go to Congress for its money, and Congress has very real controls. There is a long chapter in this about how that came about. It's sort of the anomalies of the U.S. federal system. But the U.S. is saying, we're going to do this. Here are some things we're going to do. This is a laundry list. So what it means, nobody's quite sure, but this is their laundry list, not mine. So it's at least a pretty good idea of the kinds of things they are focusing on. Healthcare. We always like healthcare. Electronic records, remote and home monitoring, telemedicine. We're going to have all sorts of things. A friend of mine notes that the number, and he may have his figures a little wrong. If you look at the problems of American healthcare, in the last 20 years, the number of doctors in the United States increased by about 100%, doubled. In the same period, the number of health administrators in hospitals, clinics, and insurance companies increased by 3,000%. Somewhere there's a problem here. And this is supposed to at least partially deal with. In the middle of this recession, healthcare is still one of those industries that is hiring people. So it is a massive bureaucracy that doesn't work real well. Energy and environment, smart grid, smart homes, applications, telework. Lots of things that can come out of that. Education, e-books and content, electronic student data management. They're not going to do it, but I would love them to go after the whole intellectual property rules that constrain teachers and force them into the use of textbooks that are substandard. Additional things, government operations, service delivery, efficient government, civic engagement, job training, placement and creation, economic development, public safety, interoperable voice and networks, next generation, all the kinds of stuff you see in science fiction. We're going to make it real. And predictably, some of it's going to really be an improvement, and some of it's going to fall flat on its face. We're going to see what actually works. Americans always say, if there's a deficit, we have to cut waste. We have to cut the bureaucracy. And sometimes there's some truth to that, and sometimes it's simply a slogan by those who don't want to curtail spending or those who don't want to spend. If all this works, some potential positive effects of this. Cross-sector effects, make end product sales more efficient, make input markets more competitive, enhance intra-organization communication. This is all standard stuff. There's nothing new particularly here. This is what's happening already. but we just want to jumpstart it. We're all political. We all have to deal with voters. Therefore, we must improve consumer welfare. We forget that too much sometimes, but so it's useful to come back and say, you know, if the consumers aren't benefiting and the corporations are just making a lot more money, is that really a solution you want? So reduce search and transaction costs. You want to stay connected to friends, and family and friends. I was talking with one of the people here from the news office who just gotten on to Friends, to Facebook. And, you know, there are some advantages to Facebook. There are some disadvantages. So, you know, how much, you know, it's going to lead to huge privacy issues that's already are bubbling to the surface and are going to be more when we have the cloud. And then, of course, entertainment. We're going to entertain ourselves to death in terms of all of this. But we have this crazy thing where virtual worlds and real worlds are dissecting. My two sons, after playing World of Warcraft for some years, got tired of it. Didn't disturb me at all. But I was actually find them very entrepreneurial. They had all these wizards and characters and loot in this virtual game, which, by the way, has 10 million active users around the world, spread pretty much around the world, 25% of them in Europe. And they sold their characters and the loot for $1,000 cash, US. Sounds pretty good. In India, one of the best jobs for unemployed children is playing games, developing value, and then reselling the artifacts that they create on the, and characters they create on the network. It's been calculated by J.C. Hertz that the average salary that a young Indian boy can make if he or she has access to the internet is a little over $3 an hour, or so a little over 2 euros an hour, which for parts of India, that's not bad. It may be the best job they can get. Policy issues facing those in broadband. And these are just some questions. You know, what we're going to get, not clear. How come 1/3 of the homes aren't connected? Why is that? Do they want to be connected and can't afford it? Can't they get affected? Maybe they've decided that maybe this is a new Luddite group who simply doesn't want to have anything to do with being connected. How can you create incentives for investment? Big issue. You know, this is all very expensive. Somebody's got to pay for it. Somebody's got to make a profit. I joke that the kids today expect that they should be in touch in any way they want, which is to say voice, data, images, video, anytime they want, anywhere they want, and by the way, they shouldn't have to pay very much for it. Well, at some point, you got to pay for it. Somebody's got to pay for it. So the question is, how do you do that, and how can you get people into that market? Part of it is you can, part of that has been with the Google model of improving on advertising and let those people do it. You can improve on speeds. You can promote innovation. The U.S. believes firmly that competition is a good thing. And how much competition should there be in what markets? Every different country has done it a little differently. Nobody's going to do it exactly the way the U.S. is. But where, in what segments do you want to promote competition? How are you going to do it? What is the role of wireless? And what are you going to do for spectrum? To give you some idea, when the Apple iPhone was introduced, which you could only buy from AT&T officially, though it can be unlocked by others, everybody, including AT&T, I expect, was astounded that because of the ease of use of it, the iPhone which yesterday it was announced has overtaken Nokia as the most used handheld device in the world. Americans have taken that back. That the spectrum use of the iPhones was about 50 times more than any other handheld. And AT&T was running out of space. AT&T has said that they're going to put $2 billion of investment into Los Angeles in the next 2 months because everything got much slower. What are you going to do about spectrum? How are you going to deal with it? And how are you going to balance public and private actions? So all of those are questions. None of them have good answers as of yet. Now, I'm coming to an end of this, the next tipping point. I live in Hollywood. I don't live in Hollywood, but I live next to Hollywood. Los Angeles is a company town. You know, Washington is a company town, and Washington is about government. We are about entertainment. We are about celebrity. We are about content. So the movie industry, the music industry, and the broadcast industry of the U.S. and often of the world are located there. You know, other countries make more movies, but we spend $100 million on a movie. And our colleague Henry Jenkins will tell you then how they spend another $50 or $70 million advertising it on multiple platforms across communications. The reason 50 megabits per second is on broadband, a reliable 50 megabits per second, could be very critical, is that when you get that, you can download a movie at high quality in less than 3 minutes onto your handheld. The first thing this does is wipes out the DVD market. And then it goes on from there. So those of you who think that we're not in for any more changes, it's just beginning. Anybody who tells you what it's going to look like is making it up. Nobody knows. But it's going to be a big, different thing. Now, finally, I promise some other concerns. I don't want to talk about these at any length, but they can be very important. These are issues that the White House says they are concerned about. I'm happy to talk about them in any kind of Q&A. If you want, here I just want to list them. Transparency. We like everything to be above board. Affordability to consumers, good consumer welfare. This is motherhood and apple pie kinds of things. Freedom of expression online, you know, life, liberty, democracy, all those good things we want to have. Now, one that you can't get as much information, but I assure you the governments of the world are spending an awful lot of time worrying about is cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is not the spam that people are talking about. It's not even what it really is what can this be used as it was against Estonia to try and stop an economy? What do you do during a war? How do you protect your networks? How do you protect your communications because it is vital to the continuing economy? One reason after Jonathan Pastel took over the internet that USC outsourced it was somebody reminded our general counsel that had the internet collapsed or stopped working at the time that USC actually, quote, owned it, we would have been liable, which would not have been fun if people had started to sue. Another side of cybersecurity, though, is you have to be a little careful of it. There is a balance. You don't want to have people say, well, for security reasons, I am going to control this, this, and really mean this is an industrial policy. So I won't let you do it because of security reasons. So what's real and what is made up is hard. And then the final thing that, and the list of the White House, sadly, it is the final thing they always want to mention. Oh, and by the way, we want to help developing countries. I wish it was, some people think it's higher on the list, but when you ask the White House, this is the order that is given. Last point. There is a cloud on the horizon, which we call the cloud. What happens when all of your data, corporate or individual, is floating somewhere in a cloud and you can't control it? A couple weeks ago, a cloud run by Microsoft by an ominously called subsidiary known as Danger crashed. They lost the data. And 1.5 million people who had a certain kind of cell phone lost all their address books and data and who knows what else. What do you do about that? Also, what do you do in terms of privacy? Who has access to that? And increasingly, who owns your information? I suspect there's going to be a huge question that they're going to have to face. Who owns your healthcare data? Does the healthcare plan? Does your doctor? Or do you? And if you decide to change doctors or athletic shoes from Nike to Converse, both of which have clouds on your exercise patterns, can you take that data with you to your new health insurer, your new doctor, or your new shoe company? And how do you manage to assure that the people who had it before erase it from their files? That's just the beginning of some of the issues, but let me end there. I've given you an awful lot of information in about an hour. I'm told we have to be out by 9, but we can be, if there are no questions, we can be out before that.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this tour de force, going all over the key elements of policy and, in fact, of policy in the world, and not just in the United States. Thank you. We knew that we would not be disappointed, and we aren't. And now, the next thing is for you not to be disappointed with our contribution, and I think you will not be either. So, please just go ahead.
And if I don't know who you are, please identify yourself.
And you will be recorded in the cloud immediately.
Yes. And we will keep a record.
Juliet?
Yes, thank you very much for that. My question is really about corporate control over standards.
It would be good.
Please.
Yeah. It would be good because then we really have record.
My question is about corporate control over standards, Jonathan. It's a question to ask you about where it is now in the United States. I was really interested in your statement, slightly wry statement about the open internet policy, declared policy. And I was thinking back to 10 or 15 years ago when, before the internet started to be the site for trading between corporations, and they developed inter-organisational networks that were proprietary and then eventually became sectoral. And in the course of doing so, a lot of those networks had operated with standards that were set largely on the US territory to start with, later in Europe as well, through the UN. But the big corporations were incredibly dominant in the setting of those communications standards. And so the standards themselves had written into them some of the sort of the language and interests of the corporations, the retail companies, the automotive industry and so on, the big assemblers. To what extent has that been all swept aside by the internet in your view, or located somewhere else? Or is it still the case, and is it different corporations that now control the standard setting process, for instance, through ICANN?
The corporations really don't control ICANN. All sorts of weird people do, but let me go back, because there are, as always, pluses and minuses. One of the great good pieces of good fortune about the internet is that it was not established, the technical standards were not created either by governments or by corporations. It was created by a group of technical experts from Vint Cerf to Tim Berners-Lee, who happened to be extraordinarily good, and also, by and large, weren't in it for the money. So that you had, and the US and everybody else didn't understand what they were doing. So they, in fact, delegated to these technical experts who were trying a grand new vision the responsibility, and many of them were American, but by no means all. So that on the one hand, you know, that was maybe the optimal case. And a friend of ours, Steve Weber, has written a wonderful book on open source and sort of why people volunteered their time at no pay to make things like Apache and Linux into very major competitors, and how groups like IBM and China have come to embrace open source in the form of Linux. Now they alter it and they deal with things, and there's a lot of stories there. So first, sometimes maybe accidentally, we get it right. Now, given that, you're certainly correct that large organizations of all kinds try and dominate their sectors. I made a joke earlier to people, but I believe that in my work with lots of different sectors over the last 30 years, two things always are the case. One is I have never found anybody in any sector who did not tell me, my sector is unique and we need special treatment from the government. Always. Doesn't matter if it's automobiles or telecom or applesauce makers. They all think we're special, economics don't apply to us, we really deserve special treatment. The second thing they always say, and every individual tells me, is I'm all in favor of competition in those areas that I want to get into, but there are special reasons that competition in the areas that I dominate is a lousy idea. Now, this is across the board. I've never found it. It doesn't matter what country, it doesn't matter what industry, these two truths. The third truth that I then remind them of is government's not going to go away. What they have said in 1 and 2 is the reason you want regulators to be watchful and actually to do a good job. And increasingly, one hopes NGOs throw a light on that. Now, having said that, let me turn your example to telecom, actually. The ITU was the chosen international regulator of the telecom industry. It was a club of monopolists for many years. And what you ended up having was a system which could not be broken into in the normal way. With Cowie, I wrote an article some years ago that was critical of the ITU. We got a call from a friend of ours who at that point was the executive assistant to the president of the ITU, had just started this as a new job, and he told us that we were being terribly unfair, that the ITU was a much better organization than that, and we agreed to disagree. 6 months later, after he had been there for 6 months, he called us up again And he again berated us. But this time he said we were being much too easy on the ITU. It was really much worse than anything we had suggested. It used to be a place that it was a great place to interview because all you had to do was go to the cafeteria at about 2:30. After having finished lunch, everybody was there all afternoon drinking coffee and talking. So you could interview anybody because nobody I could find seemed to work in this place, maybe for 2 hours in the morning. Now, given that, and given that basically they didn't have to work much because the telecom companies of the world told them what they believed. The U.S. in the Uruguay round of trade said, what we're going to do is we're going to do these negotiations in a new venue. We're going to go to the WTO, which everybody in the ITU, particularly the companies, thought was just a terrible idea. But it led to major changes in international rules. So moving from one unit that is dysfunctional to another. By the way, the ITU has actually improved some that in an effort to sort of get back in the game because they finally said, well, if we want to have any say at all, I guess we're going to have to live in the 20th, if not in the 21st century. So I hope that begins to answer your question. So, the answer is bad, which is sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. You better watch the corporations because they will try to rig the market.
One more comment. Eduardo Ibarra.
Yes, you have explained that network neutrality, open internet, whatever you call it, is going to be...
Whatever they call it. They don't ask me.
Is going to be one of the hot issues in the next years. Now, my question is, you mentioned...
Well, within this sector.
Yeah,
I don't know how, who understands it?
You mentioned AT&T being against it. Now, my question is, what are other actors against it, not being corporations or commercial?
Basically, what you're going to see, the old telecom companies are worried about it. The Googles of the world, even the Microsofts of the world, think it's a really good idea because they want to send content every which way, so that they are very supportive. And this White House likes Google more than it likes AT&T, but AT&T still has some real juice. So it will be a compromise. It won't be one way or the other.
Rosa Borges.
Yes, I would like you... my name is Rosa Borges. I belong to the Open University of, to this university. So my question is about one question that you stated in your presentation, that was why are 1/3 of homes not connected? Well, you leave the question in the air, and I would like you to answer if you have some answers to this, because we have also the same problem here, and we don't know if it's a question of infrastructure, it's a question of attitude, a question of social class, or in that sense, I would like you to, your opinion.
We don't know either.
Well, okay.
It is comparable. I had dinner with a real free market investment banker recently. And I said, look, we got 46 million people who are unemployed or who have no health insurance. And his immediate knee-jerk response was, well, most of them are probably young people who don't want insurance. I'm dubious. I'm really dubious. But we have to say that we don't know. That's why I posed it as a question. And, academics are good for something. We're actually trying to put together some research surveys to find out exactly that answer. But we assume it's a mix of reasons, including they can't get it, or it's too expensive, or you have certain demographic groups who are late adopters. I don't know. I don't know a good answer. I suspect there would be a lot of interest in. I think you have a better data sometimes in Spain and Catalonia than you do in the U.S. And I suspect there would be a fair amount of interest in that question on the FCC. You know, they actually like to know what others are doing too.
Yeah, well, I just can mention this, the survey we did on Catalonia. This is only in Catalonia. In Spain, there is no such a similar survey. In 2003, we actually, since we analyze the uses and non-uses in every aspect among people with internet and with no internet, at that time the majority of people didn't have the internet, and we asked, and in fact the results of the analysis among those who didn't have internet was basically one-third, one-third, one-third. One-third was too expensive in their perception. I'm not saying that that was the case. One-third, they didn't know what to, they didn't know how to use it, according to them. And another third were they didn't know what for, what could be the services that they would get. But for us, the most interesting data is that overwhelmingly, the main variable that explained the three groups was age, overwhelmingly. The large majority of those not having internet were people over 50. And over 65%, the majority of the population didn't have internet and didn't want to have internet. So in that sense, it's kind of a vicious circle. Is that you don't have it, so you don't know what it is. You don't even know how to do it or what to do for, and therefore you have no interest. You don't have it, and you keep going. So in that sense, I believe that the things would change extraordinarily with the biological rule of passing away one generation.
I'm looking for some data on this. The OECD every 2 years publishes a communication outlook report where if you really want to see data on what's going on, this is a very good place. And I'm looking right now. I happen to have this sitting on my computer and
sitting on the cloud.
Sitting on the, well, actually it's on I downloaded it, so it's actually on my computer. And what is interesting is the monthly household expenditures on ICT among countries. This is OECD mainly. I don't have it on this, but what you see is on, this is US dollar purchasing power parity. So all of them are the same. It doesn't quite work for the US because the US doesn't have internet costs in it. So it is best to leave the US out of this because it's not comparable. But it finds that the highest among these countries is Ireland, followed very closely by the United Kingdom and Switzerland, and fourth, very close to the other three, but considerably above everybody else, is Spain. So one of the reasons I suspect, in addition to this, is except for the three countries I mentioned, it is more expensive for the average Spaniard to, in terms of their household expenditures on ICT, than it is for many others. So that if you compare it even to Japan, Spain is 25% more expensive, more than you get. So that part of this means it's not being provided at an affordable price. And I leave it to Spanish authorities to figure out how to improve that situation.
Yeah, there were some.
Well, my name is Jorge Luis Salcedo. I am from Autónoma University from Barcelona. And well, you talk about the cloud, and in my point of view, is one of the next tipping point, and really something very, well, it's something very new, and there is a lot of questions about this new technology. But one of these questions is what actors it's going to be the responsibles to regulate these, to regulate the cloud. I don't know. Maybe it's a question that other people have, but I think that is a very important question. And international associations, a country.
Fair enough. I think that we have very recently seen on the international level a very positive development. That the main group of leaders who met on sort of big issues of the world has been, in the last 20 years, the G8. It started as the G7, and then we added Russia. What happened in Pittsburgh recently was the G20 was created, which includes a lot of the larger developing countries as well. And what it looks to me is happening is that the G20 is going to more and more be the critical top-level group that is going to make a lot of these decisions. And it is wider, so you get Brazil, you get China, you get India. All are sitting at the table. Now, all of them won't participate on all issues, but it is not, of course, a completely representative group. But the problem is that what you need to do at the very top is there only can be so many people in the room. The joke I make to my students sometime is if they can agree on a final exam unanimously among 50 of them, I'll give them their final exam. I've never worried that they can negotiate among themselves a document. At the WSIS meeting, which was an attempt in part to democratize the internet and restore the ITU and get lots of organizations, I recently looked at the list of organizations and representatives that were acknowledged by the group in Tunis. I don't know how they all got there. There were 315 pages of representatives single-spaced. Now, I can assure you that the leaders of the industrial world thought this was hilarious, because there was absolutely no possibility that anything could be agreed on other than saying, you know, we care about this topic, so that the people who actually are going to make the decisions are going to go back and say, there seems to be a lot of people who care about this. What do we think? But, 315 pages, with 30 people in the room, you can't decide where to go for lunch. How are you going to decide international things? So that the problem is to craft venues and organizations that are flexible enough that sometimes they have public, sometimes they have private, that they have the key representatives from different points of view to sit down and work things out, that they have to have enough technical expertise that it makes some sense. If it were easy, it would have been done. We have been talking about my next book, and one of the things I am seriously considering is trying to write something that essentially says, how does one go about answering the question that you have posed? And I have a bit of ideas and a bit of insight, but this is what you would call a hard problem. This is not an easily solved problem. And but it's probably, I'm at a point in my career that is probably worth taking a stab at, because if it comes together, that would be terrific. And if it doesn't come together, somebody else can figure it out.
Thank you.
Yes, Marcel Clare from CMT. For what you said about what's going on in Australia, Finland, and I could add maybe Greece, Sweden, and other countries, it would seem like as if the pendulum is moving towards more of a more interventionist policy by the states into the market. Would you take this as an indication of somehow of a failure of the whole deregulation, liberalization exercise, or as a needed correction, or how would you?
I think it is a correction. We had a group for the last 8 years who were true believers in the markets. We've seen how that worked out in the financial networks. I do not think that this group is, so that what happens, any departure from that, is the people who are no longer in power say, it's socialism, it's government intervention, it's terrible. What it is a return to the mean. There is a role for government. But it ought to be done judiciously. I mentioned to a couple of you were there, my favorite single piece of regulation ever. Had to do nothing with telecom, but you know what I'm coming to. But it was an instance that the Swiss developed in terms of toxic pollution of their rivers. And this is a long time ago. And they didn't want to sort of tell people what they could or could not dump into the rivers. So they passed a very simple rule. This has come from Charles Schultz's, is my source on this, which said, you can dump anything you want in the rivers, as long as you dump it upstream of your intake valve. So anything you dump in has to come right back into your plant. That's nice. That's the kind of regulation I truly like to celebrate.
Xavier Castillo from ITIC and Polytechnic University of Catalonia. The list of questions regarding broadband that you showed us, well, it's the same list of questions that we have now. We have just a public consultation made by government asking for all these things. Mm-hmm. And you also described the decision-making process by ITU first, by the internet team later on, which is radically different. In addition, today we have regulatory bodies, politicians also like now to give opinions on all that. In your view, what would be the most rational way to find the answers to these questions?
Academic research.
Funded by the technology company.
Yeah. No, I'm a believer in mixing and matching. I'm happy to get it from McKinsey. I'm happy to get it from governments. I'm happy to get it from private sector. I'm happy to get it from academics. I, in fact, prefer some duplication, getting it in a way that people are reinforcing and questioning. On the other hand, I'm a believer in science. A friend of mine, to give you some sense, in the United States, there is a huge debate about global warming. And this is CO2, global warming. And this is partly on the basis of the structure of our media. Somebody, and I don't remember the citation exactly, took a close look at the popular press, the radio, the journals, and the percentage of articles which were fundamentally based on science. There is a real thing called global warming. You can argue about what percentage of it is caused by humans, but you know, something's going on. This is the warmest 25 years on the planet in the last 10,000. 60% in the popular press said, yes, there's something going on. About 40% said, this is bunk. They then looked at refereed scientific journals, and there the results were somewhat different. 100% said there was something going on, and 0% said there was nothing going on. That's a problem. So I really like research from different things. I don't always like, I would rather have arm's length research so that the interested parties might pay for some of it, but not be able to call the shots.
By the way, just comment on this, the analysis that was done on this media data comes not so much that the media thought differently, but that this very stupid rule of the media that you need one side of the thing and another side of the thing. So you end up with 50% on any issue in terms of the exposure, because that's to be clean, even if one is 0 and the other is 100. Okay?
And even if one part actually knows what they're talking about and the other part is idiots.
If any one of you is interested in raising some issue, comment, or question, and you feel more comfortable in Catalan or Spanish, you can say so, and I'm happy to translate. Si alguno quiere hablar en catalán o español, le puedo traducir.
But you have to speak in English.
Okay, it's okay. It's almost 9, but I was wondering if maybe you can spend 2 minutes talking about the peer-to-peer networks. You know, Spain has one of the highest rates.
Do I have to?
In
yes,
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Spain has one of the highest rates of illegal downloading. And since you're living in the entertainment capital of the world, very close to the industry, what is your opinion on that subject? A lot of governments and courts are trying to regulate, but you know, the moment one of these websites is shut down, 2 new websites are born. So
I think that the music industry, and to a slightly lesser extent the movie industry, live in a dream world, and that companies who make a point of prosecuting their customers have a serious problem. Recently, the movie industry has gone so far as to say, in effect, anybody who steals our content, you know, if we can't control it and get our fair share, we ought to shut down the internet. Now, they didn't put it in quite that blunt of words, but that's how it was interpreted. The positive side of it is that there are a few companies who are beginning to search for new value models and new business models that recognize it's going to be downloaded. You know, you're not going to stop it. And terrorizing people, customers, is not a good long-term strategy for this. It also, in terms of the politics of it, I held a meeting recently with where there were a couple of movie companies, you know, quite senior levels, but also a lot of the high-tech companies, names that you would know very well. And one of the 2 movie companies there said, you know, essentially we've got to shut it down and we've got to stop piracy come what may. You know, stealing movies or songs is the same thing as stealing shoes. Well, it's not. The marginal cost is 0 in terms of this. If they weren't going to go buy it if they didn't download it. what was most intriguing is that every other high-tech company in the room, and there were about a dozen of them, were appalled. They basically said, come on, we may not agree with everything, but that's not an acceptable, viable, or sustainable long-term position. So, of course we want you to make money. That's the good American way. Go capitalism. But you better be smarter in how you make it than to think you're going to stop this downloading in the way you are, because you're really getting very disruptive and giving us giving us all a bad reputation. So that may be more than 2 minutes. It's not just the peer-to-peer, but you're going to get some real problems actually with the network neutrality, because what we do have is some real issues in terms of spectrum because of huge numbers of movie downloads, paid or unpaid. The streaming video, you don't really want it to disrupt your phone service in terms of that. And so that there's some real issues that have to be dealt with, but that's the wrong one, I think.
Yes, as a personal anecdote, this situation evolves every day. This afternoon, I got an email from Harvard asking my permission to upload my lecture there in iTunes, which is a strange idea for me, lectures in iTunes. Why not? But I will have to ask how much money they charge to the people for that. So, Marta,
and I signed a contract with this organization that this will be uploaded, I gather, not only to the UOC site, but to YouTube.
Well, that's the work channel. Marta Continente.
Lamento la lengua, pero habrás de ejercer de traductor. Ha hablado como elementos adicionales que me imagino que, entendiendo que hablábamos en lo global, sobre los propósitos de la administración Obama en la eficiencia en el sí de la administración, la transparencia, hablaba también del servicio 911, etc. Nosotros lo seguimos con mucho interés, lo que está pasando allí. Entonces, siempre me queda la duda si la política que van a poder hacer en este periodo es abrirlas, lo que han hecho en el Open Data, o si existe realmente toda una organización que esté trabajando profundamente en el cambio de la administración, que realmente es uno de los retos eternos, ¿no?, que tenemos. Este es un tema y otro, pero todo a minuto, porque ya sé que es muy tarde. Pero cuando hablabais del cloud computing y de la posibilidad de pasar a la nube las aplicaciones, ¿en qué calendario? Porque yo lo que veo es que el grado de complejidad que tienen las aplicaciones, yo creo que es el futuro y es lo que vamos a ver, pero el grado de complejidad es tan grande que nos va a costar muchísimo pasar a la nube muchísimas de las cosas que tenemos, ¿no?
Thank you, Marta. So this time is simpler for you. It's 2 questions to 1 minute answer. And the 2 questions are...
yes and no.
No, that's the answer. But the 2 questions are, you have been talking about the Obama administration, and they are going to implement new policies based on the strategy of open data, but how this can be done without changing or reforming or restructuring the administration, the government, the bureaucracies. So what is the connection between changing the networks of information and changing the administration, because that's what Catalonia is working very much in that, and actually Marta Continente is directing that program. And what is the relationship between organizational change and technological change in open data? When you answer that, I will tell you the second.
Remember, Obama used the internet to get elected more effectively than any major candidate in history. He collected in that time about 12 million email addresses. I still get emails from him, and I'm sure Manuel does.
Oh, twice
every
a day.
week. Because he continues to use that. Now, one of the...
Oh, Marta also receives.
in catalog?
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that is paramount in the way he operated was through transparency. So that what he is doing systematically across the government is to try and make operations, records, and developments more available on the internet to anybody who wants it. So that the major change is by opening up the process, by putting many more documents on the web much more rapidly. And this is causing some of the organizational change that happened. I mentioned you can't put 3 FCC commissioners in the same car without legal supervision recently. The reason for that goes back to precisely this. That would be a quorum, and they could change the rules. So they literally, they are mandated that their meetings must be open. You know, anybody can come in and wander in and look in. Now they do things beforehand that behind closed doors a little bit, but the actual decision meetings have to be open. So that I think that the key there is there seems to be a real genuine commitment to transparency, which most of the time is good. Though sometimes a backroom deal really works nicely.
Paco, you translate it? Okay.
Second?
Second question, yes, the cloud seems to be in the horizon, but what would be, in your opinion, the schedule, the calendar for the development of the cloud, because there is such complexity in the applications that govern the formation and use of the cloud, that we cannot actually see it in the short term. What do you think?
If I really, I've been really pretty good over the years about technological forecasting. But if my timing were any good at all, I'd be a whole lot richer than I am. So that I can't give you a really good answer in terms of that, except to say I don't think that it is going to come at one point. I think it is going to be an additive process where the complexity becomes greater, that there are going to be lots of experiments. Some of them are going to work, some of them are going to fail. But I'm pretty brash, but even I am not brash enough to predict when it's going to come. To give you some sense, I at one point looked for articles on communications convergence. The earliest I could find was one in about 1974, predicting the imminent convergence of communications. 30 years later, we're sort of getting there.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Well, it is exactly 9 o'clock. We are serious people at the IN3, so thank you.
And thank you.
We really appreciate